Think about the most spiritually committed person you know, the one who prays before sunrise, who carries other people's pain like luggage they never set down, who reads the ancient words not as obligation, but as oxygen. Now ask yourself a question that nobody in any church, mosque, or synagogue will ever ask out loud. Why is that person always the most exhausted, not tired from overwork, not tired from too little sleep, tired in a way that cannot be measured on a chart or fixed with a vacation? A specific kind of depletion that lives behind the eyes, that follows them into quiet rooms, that makes them stare at walls and not know why. You have seen it. Maybe you are living it right now. And here is the part that should disturb you. They cannot explain it. Nobody can explain it. They just call it burnout, or spiritual warfare, or depression. And then they go back to praying harder, giving more, serving longer, and they get more depleted, not less. What if the exhaustion is not a symptom? What if it is a mechanism? What if someone designed it? Across 14 centuries of church history, a document trail exists, most of it buried, some of it burned, pieces of it hidden in clay jars in Egyptian desert caves, that describes in clinical detail a system of spiritual extraction, a mechanism by which conscious entities feed on the energy of people who are actively seeking God. These entities were named, their methods were mapped, their weak points were recorded, and then, in a series of decisions made by powerful men in the 3rd and 4th centuries, every text that named them was systematically destroyed. What survived is enough to reconstruct the mechanism, and once you understand how it works, you will never be able to unsee it. My name is not important. What matters is what I found. Let me show you. There is a word that appears in almost every surviving Gnostic text from the 1st and 2nd centuries. The word is Archon. In classical Greek, it simply means ruler, magistrate, one who holds authority. But in the theological vocabulary of the earliest Christian communities that existed before the Roman Church standardized what was allowed to be believed, Archon meant something far more specific and far more threatening. An Archon in the ancient Gnostic framework is not a demon in the medieval sense. It is not a horned creature who tempts you to lie or cheat. It is something considerably more sophisticated. The Archons, according to texts that predate or run parallel to the canonical Gospels, are consciousness-like entities embedded in the structure of the material world. They do not want your sin. They do not care about your morality. What they feed on is something else entirely, something the ancient writers called Pneuma, the Greek word for spirit, breath, the animating force that separates a living person from a corpse. And according to the suppressed texts, the people who generate the highest concentration of Pneuma are not the wicked. They are the ones searching most intensely for the divine, the chosen ones, the seekers, the ones who never stop trying to reach something higher. Those are the targets. The Apocryphon of John, one of the oldest documents recovered from the Nag Hammadi library, a cache of 52 texts buried in the Egyptian desert near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, discovered by a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman in December of 1945, describes the creation of the Archons in language that reads less like mythology and more like engineering. The text, which scholars date to the 2nd century but which likely preserves oral traditions considerably older, explains that the Archons were brought into existence not by the supreme God, but by a secondary, flawed creator entity called the Demiurge. The Demiurge fashioned a material world, and embedded within that world a system of management, a hierarchy of energy-harvesting entities whose function was to prevent human beings from remembering their true spiritual origin. This is not allegory. The writers of the Apocryphon of John are very clear. They are describing a real mechanism operating in real time on real human beings. And the mechanism has a specific name in multiple texts. It is called, in the hypostasis of the Archons, also from Nag Hammadi, the harvesting of light. In the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, the same process is called the pollution of the name, a ritual contamination of the spiritual seeker that depletes their capacity for connection with the divine source. In the Pistis Sophia, a text so threatening to Orthodox authorities that it survived only in a single Coptic manuscript hidden in London for centuries, the Archons are described as having specific regions of influence, specific frequencies of attack, and specific methods of extraction. And the primary method, the one described in the most clinical detail, is what we would today call chronic, unexplained spiritual fatigue. The chosen ones are exhausted without reason because the reason was erased. Before we go further, I need to show you something. Because right now, if you have been raised in a traditional church setting, a part of your mind is resisting this. It sounds like fringe material. It sounds like something you find on conspiracy websites, not in respected academic libraries. And that resistance, that instinct to dismiss, is itself something the ancient texts predicted. The Apocryphon of John states directly that the Archons instill in human consciousness a specific impulse toward forgetfulness. The Greek word used is epinoia, the capacity for reflective understanding. And the text says the Archons work constantly to suppress it, to keep human beings from thinking clearly about the nature of their own spiritual experience. You have been told that the Gnostic texts are heresy. You have been told they were rejected because they were theologically wrong, doctrinally confused, spiritually dangerous. But here is what you were not told. The men who made that decision, who decided at the Council of Nicaea in 325 and in subsequent councils through the 4th century, which texts would become the Bible and which would be destroyed, those men had enormous political power riding on that decision. The Roman Emperor Constantine did not gather church leaders at Nicaea for a theological seminar. He gathered them to produce a unified religion that could serve as the social cement of a crumbling empire. Doctrinal diversity was not a theological problem. It was a political problem. And the texts that described an architecture of invisible controllers embedded in the structure of the world were not rejected because they were false. They were rejected because they were destabilizing. A population that understands it is being harvested is a population that cannot be managed. Before I show you the specific mechanics of the Archon Drain system, I need to pause here. Because what I am about to describe has direct implications for your life, not for ancient spiritual philosophers, not for Gnostic mystics in the Egyptian desert, but for you, right now, in the body you are sitting in. And there is a resource that was compiled specifically for this moment, for people who are watching a video like this because something in them already knows that the exhaustion is not random, that the depletion has a pattern. That resource is called 7 Shocking Signs That God Warns About the End Times, and it connects the ancient suppressed knowledge with the prophetic warnings that did survive the councils and the burnings. The link is in the description, only available while this video is running. If you are feeling what this video is describing, that resource was made for you. Now let me show you the mechanism. The Archon Drain system, as reconstructed from the surviving texts, operates in 3 distinct phases. Understanding all 3 phases is what changes everything. Because most people who study spiritual warfare, even serious, devoted Christians, are only aware of the first phase, and their defenses are built around stopping something that is not actually the primary attack. Phase 1 is what the texts call the obstruction of ascent. This is the layer of the mechanism that most closely resembles what traditional Christianity describes as demonic interference. The Archons, according to the Pistis Sophia, occupy what the text calls the 13 aeons below, a series of graduated planes of existence that lie between the material world and the divine source. When a human soul attempts to connect with the higher spiritual reality through prayer, meditation, deep worship, genuine seeking, it must pass through these planes. And at each plane, the resident Archon applies what the text calls a counterforce, a drag, an obstruction. The seeker experiences this as distraction, as sudden doubt, as an inexplicable inability to concentrate during the very moments they are trying most intently to connect. You have felt this. The moment you sit down to pray and your mind floods with everything except the presence you are seeking. The moment of genuine spiritual breakthrough that gets interrupted. The dream that was showing you something important and dissolved the moment you woke. These are not random neurological events. The ancient texts say these are the first phase of a deliberate mechanism, but phase 1 is not where the real drain happens. Phase 1 is the distraction system. It is designed not primarily to steal energy, but to force the seeker to expend energy in resistance, to pray harder, to fast longer, to give more, to try to override the obstruction through sheer spiritual effort. And in doing so, in responding to the first phase with intensified effort, the seeker enters phase 2. Phase 2 is called, in the texts, the entrapment of the luminous seed. This is the phase that the ancient writers considered most dangerous and most subtle, because phase 2 does not attack the seeker directly. It infiltrates their spiritual community. The Testimony of Truth, another Nag Hammadi text, describes in remarkable detail how archons embed themselves in religious institutions, not in the wicked members of those institutions, in the righteous ones, in the leaders who genuinely believe they are serving God. The mechanism works through what we might call sincere misdirection. The archon does not need a corrupt priest. It needs a devout one who has been given a slightly wrong map, who teaches spiritual authority structures that keep seekers dependent on intermediaries rather than developing their own direct connection to the divine source, who frames spiritual exhaustion as evidence of insufficient faith rather than as evidence of extraction, who keeps the congregation in a perpetual cycle of striving, failing, repenting, and striving again, never accumulating the spiritual energy reserves that would allow genuine breakthrough. This is one of the most specific claims in the ancient texts, and it is also one of the most verifiable. Look at the pattern in your own experience. Look at the people around you who have been in church the longest, who have given the most, who have served the hardest. Are they growing in peaceful power and luminous stillness? Or are they exhausted in a way they cannot name? The texts say the second phase produces a specific signature. The seeker becomes more devoted to the system of seeking than to the thing being sought. They measure their spiritual life by attendance, by service, by doctrinal correctness, by how hard they are trying, and the trying itself becomes the mechanism by which they are drained. The harder they try, the more energy they generate. The more energy they generate, the more efficiently they are harvested. It is, in the language of the ancient texts, an elegant trap. And it was built into the very structure of the institutional church before the ink on the New Testament canon was dry. Now here is where it gets specific, and where the canonical Bible, even in the form the councils allowed to survive, shows unmistakable fingerprints of the suppressed knowledge. Open the letter of Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12. Paul writes, and this is in every surviving manuscript, the councils could not remove it without destroying the text entirely. He writes, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." The word translated as principalities is, in the original Greek, archai, beginnings, origins, rulers, the same root as archon. The word translated as powers is exousiai, authorities, delegated governing forces. The word translated as rulers of the darkness is cosmocrators, world controllers. Paul is not speaking metaphorically. He is not using apocalyptic language as poetic decoration. He is describing, with the precision of a man who has encountered these entities directly, and the New Testament account of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus is in part a description of that encounter. He is describing an organized hierarchy of non-human entities whose function is governance of the material world and whose operations include keeping human beings away from the higher spiritual reality. This is the canonical Bible. This survived the councils. This is in your pew Bible right now. But the texts that explained what these entities are, how they operate, and most crucially, how they drain the energy of seekers, those texts did not survive. They were burned, not because they were false, because they were too specific. But Paul does not stop at naming the hierarchy. He continues in Ephesians 6 verse 13 to describe a response. And this is where something extraordinary happens in the canonical text, something that only makes sense if Paul is describing a real mechanism and not a metaphor. He says, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." The word translated as stand, histemi in the Greek, does not mean advance. It does not mean attack. It does not mean pray harder, give more, strive further. It means hold your position, maintain your ground, do not be moved. Paul is not describing offensive warfare. He is describing the specific posture that protects against extraction. The armor is not a weapon system, it is a containment system. It is the recognition that the primary danger is not an enemy who wants to defeat you in battle, but an entity that wants to drain you by keeping you in perpetual motion, perpetual effort, perpetual striving, because motion generates the exact energy the mechanism is designed to harvest. Stand. That is the instruction. And in the context of the Archon Drain mechanism described in the suppressed texts, that single word becomes the most sophisticated spiritual technology in the entire letter. The book of Daniel gives us another fingerprint. Daniel chapter 10, verse 12 through 14. An angel appears to Daniel and says, and this is astonishing, read it carefully. The angel says, "Do not fear, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. 21 days. An angelic messenger, sent in direct response to Daniel's prayer, was blocked for 21 days by an entity called the Prince of the Kingdom of Persia. Not the human king of Persia, not a human army, a spiritual prince, an Archon-level entity with enough power to delay an angelic messenger for 3 weeks. And notice what happened to Daniel during those 21 days. He did not know the messenger was blocked. He was praying, fasting, mourning, expending enormous spiritual energy trying to reach a heaven that was, from his perspective, silent. Chapter 10, verse 8. Daniel says, "I retained no strength." Chapter 10, verse 16. "My strength has left me." Chapter 10, verse 17. "How can this servant of my Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is any breath left in me." No breath, no pneuma, the ancient word for spiritual life force. Daniel is describing, in the canonical Bible, in language that survived every council and every burning, the precise physiological signature of the Archon Drain. He is exhausted without knowing why. He is emptied of strength during a period of intense seeking. He is experiencing what the Gnostic texts describe in clinical detail as phase 2 of the mechanism. The depletion of the luminous seed through sustained effort against an unseen obstruction. Daniel's experience was not unique. It was the norm. The texts say it is always the norm for the chosen ones. Now let me show you phase 3, because this is the phase that nobody talks about, ever. Phase 3 is what the Pistis Sophia calls the final sealing, and it is the most disturbing aspect of the entire mechanism. Phases 1 and 2 operate while the seeker is actively seeking. Phase 3 operates on the seeker who has been broken open by the exhaustion of the first 2 phases and has, in their depletion, become genuinely humble, genuinely surrendered, genuinely open in a way that years of effort and striving never produced. This is the moment most spiritual traditions consider the breakthrough point, the dark night of the soul in the mystical Christian tradition, the moment of true conversion, the opening of the heart. Every genuine spiritual tradition in the world recognizes this moment as sacred, as the moment when the divine presence finally breaks through. And the Pistis Sophia says this is when the Archons move in with maximum force, because the open heart generates more pneuma than any amount of striving. The broken open seeker who has given up controlling their own spiritual process is, in the language of the ancient texts, a burning lamp in a dark room, and the entities that feed on that light do not sleep. This is why the most devastating spiritual crises in people's lives so often come immediately after their most powerful spiritual breakthroughs. The mystical encounter in the night that is followed by weeks of darkness. The revival that breaks apart the community that experienced it. the prayer meeting where the presence of God was undeniable. And then, by the following month, half the participants have walked away from faith entirely. The texts say this is not coincidence. This is not spiritual immaturity. This is the third phase of the mechanism, executing precisely as designed. The ancient writers who documented this were not pessimists. They were not saying the divine source cannot be reached. They were saying that reaching it requires understanding the terrain, understanding that the space between the seeking human and the divine source is not empty. It is managed. And here is what makes this material so dangerous to the institutions that suppressed it. The ancient texts do not say the Archons are invincible. They say the opposite. Every Gnostic text that survived, in fragments, in hidden manuscripts, in translations of translations, insists on the same central claim. The Archons operate through ignorance, not the seeker's moral failure, not the seeker's insufficient devotion, their ignorance, their not knowing that the mechanism exists. The moment you name the mechanism, its power changes. This is why the burning of the texts matters. This is why the decision made in the 4th century to destroy every document that described the Archon system in detail was not a theological decision. It was a tactical one. A population that knows it is being drained has the capacity to stop the drain. A population that attributes the drain to its own spiritual inadequacy will keep trying harder, generating more, giving more, and the mechanism continues indefinitely. There is a second thing I need to pause and tell you here, because everything I have just described connects to a pattern that is accelerating in the world right now, a pattern that the prophetic texts that did survive describe in precise terms. The 7 shocking signs that God warns about the end times is a resource that was built specifically to bridge this gap, to connect the suppressed mechanics of the ancient Gnostic texts with the prophetic framework of the canonical scriptures and the signs that are visible in the world today. If you have felt the drain, if you have recognized the mechanism in your own life or in the life of someone you love, that resource is the next step. The link is in the description, only while this video is running. Now, the question that matters. What did the ancient writers say you can do? The Gospel of Philip, which survived in the Nag Hammadi collection, contains a passage that the scholar Elaine Pagels, one of the foremost academic authorities on Gnostic Christianity, identifies as the central practical teaching of the entire Gnostic tradition. Philip writes, "He who has knowledge of the truth is a free person, but the free person does not sin, for the one who sins is a slave of sin. Truth is the mother, knowledge the father. Those who think that sinning does not apply to them are called free. Knowledge of the truth merely makes such people arrogant, which is what the words, 'it will make you free,' mean. It gives them a sense of superiority over the whole world. But love builds up." Read that again. The Archon system operates through ignorance of truth. But knowledge of truth, without love, produces arrogance. And arrogance is itself a form of disconnection from the divine source. The ancient writers understood a paradox that no institutional religion has ever fully resolved. The truth that sets you free is not information you possess. It is a quality of relationship you inhabit. You cannot think your way out of the drain. You can only love your way out. The Apocryphon of John describes this in terms of what it calls the luminous epinoia, the reflective spark of divine consciousness that the Archons cannot harvest because it is not generated by effort or striving. It is generated by recognition, by the simple, direct act of knowing what you are, not believing it, not working toward it, not earning it through spiritual performance, knowing it the way you know your own name. The texts say the Archons feed on the energy generated by the gap between who you believe you are and who you actually are. The seeker who believes they are broken, insufficient, spiritually unworthy, who generates enormous energy trying to close the gap between their actual self and the divine self they are reaching toward, is a perpetual energy source. The person who simply recognizes, in a single moment of genuine clarity, that the gap does not exist, that the divine source is not above them or ahead of them, or at the end of a long road of spiritual achievement, but is the ground they are already standing on. That recognition does not generate the striving energy the Archons harvest. It generates something else, something the texts call gnosis, not knowledge as information, knowledge as direct experience of origin. And the Archons, in every surviving text, are described as having no mechanism to extract that. This is the teaching the institutional church could not allow to survive. Because if the divine source is already present, already accessible, already the ground of every human being's existence regardless of their doctrinal position or denominational membership or level of spiritual performance, then the entire institutional infrastructure of mediated access to God becomes unnecessary. And the powerful men who gathered at Nicaea and in the councils that followed had built their world on that infrastructure. So they burned the texts, but they could not burn Daniel 10. They could not burn Ephesians 6. They could not burn the Psalms. Psalm 22, the cry of dereliction, the howl of the one who has given everything and received what feels like silence. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. This is not a psalm of spiritual failure. This is a psalm of a chosen one in the middle of phase 2 of the drain, naming the experience without flinching, holding the darkness with both hands, and refusing to pretend it is light. And the text does not end in despair. It ends in one of the most extraordinary turns in all of ancient literature, not in rescue, not in the reversal of circumstances, but in recognition. Verse 24, for he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. The drain did not stop. The circumstances did not change, but the hidden face became visible. The silence became presence, not because the seeker tried harder, because they stopped performing for the silence and simply told the truth into it. That is the technology the ancient writers preserved, not a ritual, not a formula, not a doctrine, a quality of presence, the willingness to meet your own experience with total honesty, to stop generating the performed spiritual effort that feeds the mechanism, and to simply be present to whatever is actually true in this moment. The Archon Drain mechanism is real. It has been documented since the 1st century. It was systematically suppressed, but it was never fully destroyed because the people who understood it hid what they could in clay jars in the desert, and in the margins of manuscripts, and in the mouths of children who grew up to write it down again in different words, and in the unguarded moments of the canonical texts themselves, in Daniel's trembling voice, in Paul's furious precision about principalities and powers, in the anguished honesty of the Psalms. You are exhausted because you were built to generate light, and something in the architecture of the world has been drawing on that light for as long as you can remember. That is not your fault. That is not your spiritual failure. That is a mechanism. And mechanisms can be understood, and what can be understood can be changed. The first step is always the same. The ancient writers agree across 2,000 years of suppressed tradition. Name the mechanism. Say it out loud. Not as accusation, not as paranoia, not as an excuse to stop seeking, but as simple, clear recognition. I am being drained. There is a system designed to harvest the energy of my seeking. I see it, I name it, and I am no longer going to feed it with my ignorance. This is the moment the texts describe as the beginning of liberation, not the end of the struggle. The beginning of the ability to struggle intelligently, with open eyes. With the map the ancient ones hid in the desert for you, knowing you would eventually find it. They hid it for this moment. They hid it for you. There is a man in the Gospel accounts of the New Testament who stands at the tomb of his friend for 4 days. He has wept until his body has no more tears. He is surrounded by mourners who have been telling him the right things, the theological reassurances, the promises of resurrection, the comforts of doctrine. And he has heard all of it. He knows the doctrine. He has spoken the doctrine to other grieving people. He is, by any external measure, one of the most spiritually formed people in the community, and he stands at the entrance of the tomb and he is empty. hollowed out, drained by grief and by the gap between what he knows and what he feels. And the one who stands beside him in that moment does not give another theological reassurance, does not correct his doctrine, does not tell him to pray harder or give more or serve longer. The text says simply, he wept. The divine presence enters the drain with the drained one and weeps alongside the emptiness without explanation. And then the stone is moved. That is the mechanism on the other side of the Archon Drain. Not the absence of the drain, not the pretense that the drain does not exist, but the presence that enters the drain that cannot be extracted by the mechanism because it does not enter through effort or striving, but through the simplest possible act of recognizing another person's exhaustion and choosing to be there. You are chosen. You were chosen before you knew what that meant. Before anyone explained the cost, before anyone told you that the same light that makes you capable of the things you are capable of also makes you a target. You have been paying a tax you never agreed to on an energy you never fully understood you possessed. Now you know what it is called, and now you cannot unknow it. The desert is behind you. The clay jars are open. The texts are in your hands. What happens next is not a performance. It is not a striving. It is not another loop of the mechanism dressed in better theological language. What happens next is simply this. You remember. And the Archons, the principalities, the powers, the world controllers, the rulers of the darkness of this age, have no mechanism for what happens when a chosen one simply remembers who they are. They never built one, because they never believed you would find the jars.